The first time I encountered an infested house, I did not see a ghost. I did not hear knocking or find objects moved. What I found was a family, a young couple with 3 children, faithful Mass goers, Rosary praying, doing everything right in a state of progressive interior disintegration that none of them could explain. Stay with me, all of it. This is not a curiosity exercise. This is information I have spent 30 years gathering at considerable personal cost, and I am telling you now because someone in the house where you are listening to me may need it before the week is out. And subscribe, because what I am going to lay out for you in the next 30 minutes, most priests will not say from a pulpit, and someone has to say it clearly. My name is Chad Ripperger. I am a Catholic priest, a Thomistic philosopher, and one of the very few formally trained exorcists still operating in the Western world. I did not choose this ministry. I have said that before, and I mean it the same way every time. I entered seminary in the mid-1980s with the intention of becoming a philosopher theologian. I wanted to teach Aquinas. I wanted to spend my career in the clean air of metaphysics, the nature of being, the nature of the soul, the nature of God's relationship to a created order that He sustains in existence from one instant to the next. That was the plan. What I discovered in seminary and then in the parish life that followed ordination was that there was a population of people quietly desperate, usually dismissed, often medicated into silence, who were experiencing phenomena that no psychiatric framework I had encountered was adequate to explain. Not because psychiatry is illegitimate. Psychiatry is legitimate within its proper domain. The soul has appetites. The brain is an organ. Disorders of both are real, and they can look similar from the outside. The problem is not that psychiatry exists. The problem is that for roughly 50 years, from the late 1960s through the 1990s, the theological category of genuine demonic activity was effectively removed from the formation of most Western priests. They were trained to refer out, to defer to the medical model, to treat claims of supernatural attack as symptoms requiring management rather than realities requiring a specifically priestly response. I have spent the better part of 2 decades cleaning up the pastoral wreckage of that error. When I took up the ministry formally, the first thing I had to do was become precise. Aquinas Part 1 of the Summa Theologiae, questions 50 through 64, the treatise on angels gives us the intellectual foundation for everything the exorcist does. Fallen angels retain their angelic intelligence. Their nature is not destroyed by their rebellion. What is destroyed is their orientation toward the good, their charity, their capacity for the kind of love that is ordered toward another's true flourishing. What remains is an intellect of extraordinary power processing capacity, pattern recognition, millennia of observation of human behavior ordered now entirely toward destruction. That is what I am dealing with when I enter a case. Not a confused spirit, not residual energy, not a projection of trauma, an entity of ancient intelligence with a singular objective. Now, the subject of this confession from the archive is objects. Specifically, what objects you keep in your home, what spiritual significance they carry, and what I have documented in case after case across 30 years happens to a household that unknowingly or knowingly houses material that functions as a point of demonic attachment. I want to name what I am claiming precisely, because precision matters here. I am not claiming that every unusual object in a home summons a demon. I am not telling you to tear apart your grandmother's attic in a panic. I am not asking you to become superstitious in the negative sense, interpreting every broken appliance or illness in your family as evidence of spiritual attack. Most suffering has natural explanations. Most illness is organic. Most family conflict is the ordinary product of fallen human nature operating without sufficient grace, and the remedy is the sacraments, not an exorcism. The demonic is real, its operation is documented, the Church has theological categories for it, and the people who dismiss it entirely are not protecting you. They are leaving you without the vocabulary to recognize what you may be dealing with. What you do with what I tell you is your decision before God. That said, there is a category of object, not metaphorically but literally, physically, that functions as a point of attachment for the demonic. The Church has known this for 2,000 years. The Roman ritual of exorcism codified in 1614 under Pope Paul V contains specific prayers for the exorcism of places and objects, precisely because the tradition recognized that the demonic can attach itself to matter. St. Thomas Aquinas teaches that demons operate through influence on secondary causes. They cannot create substance. They cannot override the intellect directly, but they can work through the material world in ways that produce real effects. This is not folklore. This is Catholic theology. I will describe the family I mentioned at the beginning of this confession. I will not give details that identify them. I will describe composite elements, patterns I have observed across multiple cases, without naming individuals or locations, but I will not soften what I describe. You need the truth, not a comfortable abstraction. The husband was a man in his early 40s, professional, careful, practical. His wife was similarly grounded. Their children were 8, 11, and 14. They had moved into the home roughly 18 months before I was called. In the first year, nothing dramatic. A sense of heaviness in the lower level of the house, interrupted sleep, the children reporting unease in specific rooms. The 14-year-old began having episodes at night that his parents initially attributed to adolescent anxiety. The parents' relationship, by their own account solid for over a decade, began to deteriorate in ways neither of them could trace to a specific cause. Arguments with no real content, coldness, mutual suspicion without any identifiable reason. The father began missing Mass in the mornings, not from any deliberate decision, but from what he described as a progressive heaviness that made it impossible to rise on time. The wife began to feel that prayer, specifically the Rosary she had prayed since childhood, was useless. Not that she doubted the faith intellectually. She doubted whether anything she did spiritually was capable of reaching anyone. This is a pattern I have observed in cases of object infestation. Not the dramatic phenomena, levitation, voices, physical contortion, but this gradual erosion of everything that constitutes the spiritual life of a household, the sacraments becoming burdensome. Marital unity fracturing without external cause, prayer feeling inert. The children, whose natural receptivity to the spiritual is not yet filtered through years of rationalist conditioning, registering the disturbance first, the adults dismissing what the children report. When I visited the home, I walked through it with a ciborium containing a single consecrated host, sealed in a pyx, concealed in my coat pocket. I do this routinely. The demonic does not react to an object's external appearance. It reacts to the real presence of Jesus Christ within the Eucharist, because what it responds to is not matter, but the divine person contained within the matter. By the time I reached the basement, there was an involuntary physical reaction in me, not fear exactly, but what I can only describe as the heightened alertness that comes when something ancient and hostile is very close. In the corner of the basement, on a shelf with other items that had accumulated from a previous occupant, was a wooden board. The family did not recognize its significance. It had been there when they moved in. It was a Ouija board, not the Parker Brothers mass market version sold in toy stores, though I want to address that product as well. This was older, handmade, the kind of object that someone had made with specific intent. Beside it, wrapped in cloth, were a set of tarot cards, also from the previous occupant, also old. The family had not used either object. They had simply never cleared the shelf. They did not know what they were housing. I am going to address this theologically now, and I want you to stay with me, because this is where the tradition becomes precise in ways that are pastorally essential. What is the Church's teaching on these objects? Not the popular culture interpretation, not the horror movie version, the actual theological teaching. St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologiae, Part 2.2. Questions 95 through 96 addresses divination seeking hidden knowledge or future events through means other than God. He classifies it as a form of the sin of superstition that involves explicitly or implicitly the involvement of demonic agency. The Church's understanding which Aquinas synthesizes from Scripture and the Fathers, is that divination, by its nature, constitutes an implicit or explicit pact, a structured interaction with entities other than God. The first letter of Peter, chapter 5, verse 8, says it plainly. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. The Greek verb used there, peripete, means a deliberate, purposeful walking, not random menace, systematic search for the vulnerable. The Curé d'Ars, St. John Vianney, who served the parish of Ars from 1818 until his death on the 4th of August, 1859, documented his encounters with what he called le grappin the hook, the grabber, across 41 years of priestly service. He did not experience these attacks in dramatic exorcism sessions. He experienced them in his bedroom at night. Physical attacks, physical sounds, supernatural interference with his sleep and his ministry. A man who had destroyed the local dance halls and cleaned up a parish in spiritual ruin was apparently a significant enough threat that the enemy visited him regularly for 4 decades. Saint. John Vianney did not treat this as evidence of a disordered imagination. He treated it as an occupational reality of serious priestly ministry and pressed forward. Padre Pio Francesco Forgione, born in 1887, who received the stigmata on the 20th of September 1918 at the Capuchin Friary of San Giovanni Rotondo, documented physical attacks by demonic forces throughout his ministry, not symbolic encounters, physical beatings witnessed by other friars. The Church, which does not confirm these things casually, has canonized him and recognized the authenticity of his ministry. These are not legends. These are documented facts in the cause for his canonization. The teaching of the Church from Aquinas through the modern era is that the demonic can attach itself to objects. This is not the same as animism, the primitive religious belief that objects contain spirits. This is the theologically precise teaching that a demon can use a place or an object as a point of habitual presence because of a specific action, usually an act of divination, a blood covenant, a deliberate ritual that was performed in relation to that object. The object is not itself supernatural. The demon is not inside the object the way a soul is in a body. The object functions as a legal point of access, a location to which the entity maintains a right of habitual presence because of the specific act with which it was associated. A Ouija board is not a piece of cardboard. It is an instrument specifically constructed for the act of seeking contact with the dead or with non-human entities, which is to say, from the Church's perspective, an instrument specifically constructed for an implicit act of demonic consultation. It does not matter whether the person using it believed it was a toy. It does not matter whether they believed anything was happening. What matters is the nature of the act being performed, and the nature of the act is theologically a formal invitation. Tarot cards carry a similar weight, though the tradition distinguishes between their various uses. The cards themselves, as physical objects, have a history. Their use in divination, seeking hidden knowledge about the future or the hidden through the cards as medium, constitutes, in the Church's framework, the same category of act, a formal or informal seeking of knowledge from a source other than God. I want to be clear about something that I think is poorly understood, even in Catholic circles. The person using these objects does not need to believe in their efficacy for the act to constitute a legal foothold. This confuses people. They say, I used a Ouija board at a sleepover when I was 15, and I did not believe in anything, so nothing could have happened. The theology does not agree. The act matters independent of the subjective belief of the actor. A person who walks into traffic while looking at their phone and believing themselves safe is still struck by the car. The metaphysical reality of what is happening does not depend on the participant's belief about it. Nor does the object need to be antique or dramatic. I have encountered cases where the entry point was a mass market product purchased at a major retail chain. I have encountered cases where the entry point was a set of runestones given as a birthday gift by someone who thought they were decorative. I have encountered cases where the entry point was a yoga mat, not because physical exercise is demonic, it is not, but because the mat had been used in sessions that were explicitly oriented toward invoking a specific Hindu deity by name, in which the spiritual content was not merely cultural borrowing, but active religious invocation of entities that the Christian tradition classifies as demonic. I have encountered cases involving crystals specifically acquired for and used in New Age rituals whose stated purpose was summoning spiritual guides or opening channels to non-human intelligences. And I have encountered cases involving statues and idols brought back from overseas travel objects that were not merely artistic souvenirs, but items taken from active cultic use, from shrines where worship of non-Christian entities was and is actively practiced. Most of the people in these cases were not bad people. Not one of them was a Satanist. Not one of them had intended to open anything. They had simply not been formed with the theological precision to understand what they were doing, because the catechesis that would have given them that precision was systematically gutted from Catholic formation over a period of decades. And the void was filled by a culture that treats spiritual experimentation as wellness. Back to the family. When I explained what I had found, the husband's first response was the response I encounter most frequently in practical people: skepticism. He was not hostile. He was a reasonable man, and he listened, but his trained instinct was to find a natural explanation. I gave him the one I always give. Let us remove the objects, perform the proper blessing of the house, and see whether the phenomena resolve. If they do not, I will be the first to acknowledge that I may have been wrong about the connection. If they do, you will have your answer. That is the only empirical test available to us. The objects were removed and sacramentally disposed of, burned with the proper prayers outside the home. The home was blessed from the foundation to the attic with exorcised salt, exorcised holy water, blessed oil on the door frames, a crucifix installed at the center of the main level, an image of Our Lady installed in the common area. The Rosary was prayed as a family in the home that same evening, with the family formally renouncing any and all occult attachment and formally consecrating the home to the Sacred Heart of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Within a week, the heaviness the wife had described lifted. Within 3 weeks, the husband's difficulty rising for Mass had resolved entirely. The 14-year-old's night disturbances ceased. By the time I followed up with the family 2 months later, their account was consistent. It was as if something that had been pressing down on the household from the inside out had simply been removed. I tell you this not to suggest that every family problem resolves through a house blessing. I have been in ministry long enough to know that the human will, original sin, ordinary suffering, organic illness, and the full range of natural causes produce more than enough difficulty in family life without any demonic component. But I also know what a disordered household looks like when the source is supernatural, and I know what happens when that source is properly addressed. Now, I want to go further. Because the objects I have described, Ouija boards, tarot, New Age ritual items, are the obvious ones. The ones most Catholics would remove without much argument if they were told to. What I want to address now are the less obvious categories, because these are where I find the most persistent resistance. The first is ancestral material. I have encountered cases where the infested object was a piece of furniture, a piece of jewelry, or a document that had belonged to an ancestor who was a Freemason, a practitioner of folk magic, or a member of an occult lodge. Freemasonry, depending on the rite and the degree, involves initiation rituals that constitute, in the Church's formal assessment, the Church has condemned Freemasonry repeatedly, most recently reaffirmed in 1983 under Pope John Paul II, an explicit act of covenantal relationship with a framework that excludes the Lordship of Christ. The initiation ceremonies, particularly at the higher degrees of certain rites, involve symbolic deaths, symbolic rebirths, and oaths that bind the initiate in ways the Church considers spiritually significant. When a grandfather was a third-degree Mason and the family still keeps the lodge ring in the jewelry box or the apron in the trunk in the attic, that object carries a covenantal weight that can function as a point of generational attachment. I am not saying the grandfather is damned. I am not saying the family is possessed. I am saying that in my experience across decades of practice, objects associated with explicit covenantal acts of this nature are not spiritually neutral, and their presence in a household can constitute a legal invitation. The second less obvious category is media. I want to be careful here because I do not want to become a Catholic version of the moral panic industry. Not every horror film is an invitation to the demonic. Not every dark piece of music opens a door. The human imagination engages darkness as a way of processing it, and the great literature of the Christian West is full of darkness. Dante's Inferno, the Psalms, the Book of Job. That is not what I am addressing. What I am addressing is a specific category of media that is not dark in the literary sense, but occult in the technical sense, that is produced with the stated or documented intent to function as an actual vehicle for occult content. There's a genre of music that has documented liturgical roots in satanic or explicitly demonic ritual, where the artist has publicly stated that the music is intended as an invocation, a summoning, or a form of dark spiritual practice. I am not going to name artists. I am telling you that the category exists, that it is documentable, and that in several cases I have worked. The consistent playing of this material in a home was identified by the subject themselves as the point at which their spiritual deterioration accelerated. The third, less obvious category is pornographic material. I include this in the discussion of objects because in the contemporary household it is not typically a physical object but a form of habitual engagement with digital material that has the same spiritual function as a covenantal act. I have taught for years, based on the theology of the body and the theology of the soul's spiritual faculties, that habitual grave sexual sin, particularly in the form of regular pornography, thins the spiritual protection of the person in a way that is documented in case after case. The demonic exploits the sacred specifically because of its sacred character. Human sexuality, properly ordered, is a participation in the creative and unitive love of God. When it is consistently disordered in a habitual, unconfessed state, the soul's spiritual capacity is progressively impaired. Not because God abandons the person, he never does that, but because the person has, through repeated acts of the will, created an interior landscape that is hospitable to what God is not. I am not telling you that every Catholic who has struggled with pornography is demonically oppressed. I am not asking you to interpret your own life through a paranoid lens. I am telling you the pattern is documented, that the Church has a mechanism specifically designed to address it to the sacrament of confession, and that the sacrament is not optional if you want the protection. It confers. The 4 doors, this is the framework I teach, anchored in the tradition, verified across 30 years of cases. The first is occult contact, any act that constitutes seeking knowledge, power, or contact with non-human entities outside the framework God has established through His Church. The second is habitual grave sexual sin, particularly in its disordered and unconfessed states. The third is deep unforgiveness, held as a deliberate act of will when a person chooses not to forgive as an act of defiance, not merely as a struggle. They create a legal foothold by holding themselves in a state of active spiritual self-impairment. The fourth is generational covenants, acts of explicit spiritual covenant by ancestors that have not been formally renounced and broken under proper priestly authority. These 4 doors account for the majority of the infestations I have encountered. Most of them were opened not by wicked people, but by uninstructed ones. By people who had never been told that the spiritual world is not neutral, that acts of the will have consequences that persist beyond the moment of the act, and that the Church exists in part to give us the instruments to close what has been opened. Now, I need to tell you why this situation is worse in 2026 than it was at any point in my ministry, because the acceleration I am observing is not random. The Second Vatican Council opened on the 11th of October 1962 and closed on the 8th of December 1965. It was not a bad council. I want to be theologically careful here. An ecumenical council of the Catholic Church is a legitimate exercise of the Church's magisterial authority, and I am not among those who reject its authority. What I am addressing is the implementation, the hermeneutic, as Pope Benedict XVI described it, and specifically the pastoral response to the council that in many dioceses across the Western world produced a collapse of the catechetical infrastructure that had protected ordinary Catholic families for generations. What was that infrastructure? Real presence catechesis, the consistent, clear teaching that what is received in Holy Communion is not a symbol, not a memorial meal, not a community gathering around shared values, but the literal body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. The real presence is not a devotional option. It is the central mystery of Catholic worship. A Pew Research survey that has been public for several years found that a majority of self-identified American Catholics do not believe it. That is not a survey of lapsed Catholics. That is a survey of people who identify as Catholic and still attend Mass, among whom the majority do not hold the central teaching of the faith they are nominally practicing. I cannot overstate the pastoral consequence of that data. A Catholic who does not believe in the real presence is a Catholic who has been deprived through the failure of catechesis of the most powerful protective reality in the created order. Seminary formation through the 1970s, 1980s, and into the 1990s, in many Western institutions treated the demonic as metaphor. I have spoken with priests my own age and older who were explicitly told in formation that reports of possession were evidence of psychological disturbance and that the appropriate response was referral, not the rite. The Roman ritual of exorcism was treated in many formation programs as a relic of pre-scientific thinking. The 1999 revised rite of exorcism, which many bishops barely permit their priests to request permission to use, requires in its current form a significant bureaucratic process before a full solemn exorcism can be authorized. I am not attacking the current rite. I am noting that the barriers to accessing the Church's most powerful public prayer on behalf of a possessed or severely oppressed individual have increased at precisely the moment when the need for that prayer has also increased. The collapse of sacramental confession, weekly or monthly confession, for serious Catholics was standard through the mid-20th century, has removed a regular mechanism of grace that served as a kind of spiritual maintenance. When the soul's defenses are regularly renewed through the sacrament of penance, the legal footholds available to the demonic are regularly cut. When confession becomes a once-a-year Easter duty, or something people do when they feel like they need it, which in a culture of therapeutic self-forgiveness and moral relativism becomes effectively never, the accumulation of unconfessed grave sin over years and decades creates a very different spiritual landscape than the one the Church was designed to inhabit. The attack on the family, no-fault divorce since California in 1969, the normalization of contraception, the redefinition of marriage, the progressive targeting of children through both the educational system and the entertainment complex has systematically dismantled the natural unit of human spiritual protection. The family, properly formed, is not merely a social unit. It is an ecclesia domestica, a domestic church. The home is, in Catholic teaching, consecrated space when it is properly ordered with the cross on the wall, the holy water at the door, the rosary prayed together, the father exercising his priestly role over his household. When the family is dismantled, when fathers are absent or passive, when mothers are spiritually isolated, when children are formed primarily by screens rather than by the community of the church, the spiritual protection that the family structure itself provides is dismantled with it. I am not telling you that every failure in every family is a demonic plot. I am telling you the pattern is coherent, sustained, and historically unprecedented in its simultaneity, and that a specifically priestly response is inadequate without a corresponding renewal of the family structure within which the sacraments operate. What do? I am going to tell you exactly, because this is the section that matters. Go to confession this week, not next month, not when you feel ready, this week. Bring grave sin. If you have not been in a year or more, bring what you remember. Bring your honest accounting of the state of your soul before God, and receive the absolution that Jesus Christ gave the apostles authority to pronounce on the evening of his resurrection, standing in the locked room where they hid, breathing on them and saying, John 20, verse 23, whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven them. Whose sins you retain, they are retained. That is not a historical text. That is